Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Gousha. This is On the Issues, our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers. People, we like to say, are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today we are joined by the police chief for the city of Milwaukee, Ed Flynn. Please give him a warm welcome. First of all, I want to say thanks to the chief for rescheduling, and thanks to you for making a change in your plans. I think our first one was first time this event was scheduled, it was canceled because of cold weather. It's been that kind of winter, hasn't it? I was glad to see the snow was yesterday and not today. But I do appreciate you being with us today for our discussion. We have a lot to talk about today. Chief, it's good to have you back at the law school. It's been here several times in the past, and today I want to spend some time talking about what we're seeing in terms of crime in the city of Milwaukee, some of the crime-fighting strategies that are being employed right now, and talk a little bit about a variety of subjects in the next hour. I'll ask questions for about 40 minutes. We'll take about 20 minutes worth of questions for my clients. Well, Chief, let's begin with what happened last year. I think many people in this room are interested and came here today to find out why we had a surge in homicides last year. We were up about 16%, 91 to 106. First time we've been over 100 in some time. So what happened and why?
Well, homicides frequently used as a bellwether of crime. It's obviously the least frequently committed crime in any big city. You know, against the backdrop of the total crime picture of perhaps 34,000 crimes a year. But nonetheless, we recognize its symbolic importance to the city's self-image, as well as the reality of its impact of victimization has on extended families and communities. One of the hallmarks of my administration has been an attempt to really understand data and to use data not only to guide deployments and to hold ourselves accountable to the broader community, but also use data to explain to the community what's happening to them. Crime is a social phenomenon. It is every bit as much as a social phenomenon as public health is, or education is, or mental health services, or issues revolving around substance abuse. It is an issue that explains the community to itself. What does it mean? So obviously we were looking at the homicide rate because it had gone up significantly. It's the first time it's been over 100 in the 6 years that I've been police chief. Before I got here, the 20-year average was something around the order of 111 or so, and we had made some significant progress. Interestingly enough, in the first half of last year, we were running basically at a record low pace for the first 6 months. January through June, we were within one or two homicides of what would have been a record-setting low year if that pace had been maintained. And then in August, we had 20 homicides, 1 month. It was the most homicides we'd had in a month, I forgot now, but in round figures, in decades. That was followed in September by 14 more homicides. So in 2 months, we had as many homicides as we'd had in the first 6 months of the year. It was extraordinary. And it was really challenging our capacity to respond, because what we were responding to in the second half had been a discernible increase in robberies. We had really reorganized, not reorganized the department, but really readapted a number of our strategies to reduce the robbery number, which we saw as concerning in the first 6 months. And in the midst of this attempt to deal with that very real problem, this incredible spate of killings occurred. What we were able to discern from that spasm, if you will, is that a number of our crime gang/crews were afflicted, ironically enough, with intra-group squabbles. It wasn't even a case of the conventional one gang fighting another gang for control of drug territory or some such thing. It was very spasmodic. It was younger. It was impulsive. There were frequently arguments and fights among people with gang associations, but the arguments and fights weren't related to what I would charitably call a business dispute. And so it was a real spasm. It abated as quickly as we tried to respond to it and to disrupt the activities of these gangs, account for the whereabouts of these crews, be in the right places at the right time, try to use social network analysis to derive from this latest victim who associates were who might be part of retaliation. And then the homicides dropped off significantly, as the robberies were at the time. So it was really concerning to us, but it was absolutely driven by two extremely violent months, and as much of our homicide problem is, it was overwhelmingly concentrated in those with significant criminal backgrounds, both victim and offender, acting out over a concentrated period of time.
I'll follow up on that in a moment, but tell us a little bit about the first couple of months of this year. We've had extremely cold weather. 5 or 6 homicides so far this year in that neighborhood.
As of today, we had a homicide last night. We've had 4 homicides. Last year at this time, I believe the number was 11 or 12. And so, of course, everybody says, well, I guess the firefighting technique of the police department is to go for cold weather. I hope to keep that quiet. But, again, some context is necessary. Last January was a record warm January, and we had, I think, 6 or 7 homicides. But in the first 6 weeks of last year, my officers took 217 guns off the streets of this city. All right? With our record-setting cold, in the first 6 weeks, we've taken 224 guns off the streets of this city. Bad guys are out there, heavily armed, predisposed to do bad things. And the weather by itself is not the deterrent, unless, of course, perhaps fewer of them cross paths. But they're out there, and they're armed. We're out there, and we're trying to disrupt the opportunities for them to get at each other. So that's significant. Crime is, trending in a good direction right now. No doubt some piece of that has to do with the number of available victims, I suppose. But I don't want people to think for a minute that just the cold weather does it for us. We had those spasms of violence in July and August. It was hot, but it wasn't the hot weather. All right, other things were going on.
I want to put this in some context. Some places around the country, some cities around the country, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, saw fairly dramatic decreases in homicides last year. Chicago employs something that I think you're interested in. It's a crime-fighting technique. It's based on research done by a sociologist at Yale, something called social distance.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? Are you using that today to address crime issues here in Milwaukee?
Well, that's a really good question, because we're constantly looking for ways to access the information we have for useful purposes. As I grew up in the police business, one of the great frustrations for us was police departments didn't know what they knew. That by definition, they collected massive amounts of information, which promptly got filed, and there was no simple, reliable way to access that information for public policy purposes. In the ensuing decades, we've gradually seen the computer revolution get to government and policing. Probably about 10 years behind everybody else, but that's the nature of trying to buy expensive things in government. You're always going to be a generation behind. Nonetheless, we now have a capacity to try to learn and know what we know. Inside our files are all kinds of reports naming all sorts of people who have been at crime scenes, have been witnesses, who have been in cars stopped that were stolen, who have been Confederates in crimes, who've been witnesses, who've been offenders, who've been victims. And, we have this rule in the department. It's based on decades of sociological research, and it's in rounded numbers. But the rounded number research of crime and justice in the last several decades tells us that 10% of our offenders are responsible for 50% of our crime. 10% of our locations generate 60% of our crime. And 10% of our victims generate 40% of our crime. Because often our victims and offenders change places on alternate days. And so the challenge for us really is high rate offenders, high rate locations, high rate of victims. Where is it occurring? What can we do to disrupt the environments that lend themselves to this disparate victimization and offending? One of the things we've learned is obviously criminals have associates. Those associates are also involved in criminality. And we have found through research, and we've been able to do this here somewhat with the tools at our disposal. This year we're investing in a better software that will help us do it closer to the way Chicago was able to do it last year, which analyzes the networks of offenders / victims and witnesses. So you basically do a chart. It looks like a gigantic spider in which you can see this guy's associates, 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 and before you know it, you've got a map of that crime crew, that gang, their rivals, their friends, their allies of today, today's allies being tomorrow's enemies. What you can do is, if you can move it quickly enough, which heretofore, using the software, we haven't been able to be as nimble as we'd like, is virtually predict, sadly not where and when, who your most likely shooting victims are for the next 6 months. You can say, based on this network, that he was at this many shooting scenes with this many crime victims, has been arrested this many times for having a gun, and this many times in a stolen car, he's going to get shot. All right? Now, what can we do to bring our attention to this individual? What can we do with this guy's parents? What can we do in terms of alerting the folks that are driving around in cruise to look for this person? And if they see him in a car full of other folks, for example, in a Chrysler product, minivan, which is, for the last 10 years, the most frequently stolen car in Milwaukee, and something that's a very happy tool for committing opportunistic robberies and burglaries, and they're easy to steal. The old minivans are, the theft target of choice in the stolen car community. What do we do when we see this guy in one of those cars in this neighborhood? We stop and say hello. Hi, how are you? Nice to see you again. Call him by name. Get inside his head. What can we do to disrupt that opportunity? Now, the challenge for us is we're slow at that kind of analysis now. Chicago got the software. They got Andrew Papadopoulos. They jumped into it with both feet, and they had a significant increase in 1 year on homicide. It's an approach that we were aware of intellectually and experimented with, and I'm hopeful as we move through this year, we'll get faster at it. But you add the network analysis component to the crime data analysis we do, and the other community-based interventions we do. Again, the goal is constantly to account for our offenders, remove their anonymity, and try to stabilize neighborhoods in which they're most likely to offend.
So what would you like to see happen right now? That's something that sounds like it's in the works, but what would you like to see happen right now that would help you address crime in this community? Is it the tightening of the juvenile system? Is it, you talked about a lot of the offenders are fairly young, and they're not strangers to the criminal justice system. What would you like to see in terms of that part of the equation?
Well, I think, as a society, we have to recognize the interrelatedness of a wide variety of social phenomena that, taken together, define the health of a city, define the health of its political processes, define the health of a society. Okay? Over the last 20 years, 25 years, some of you have been through this journey before me, although obviously much younger. What have we seen? We have seen a consistent and unrelenting disinvestment in the social network. Okay? Right now, the response of our society to issues of mental health is the criminal justice system. I've seen this for years. It's becoming more so. When I worked in Massachusetts and was the Secretary of Public Safety, Department of Corrections was one of our agencies. It was the major mental health facility of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. All right? If you have a mental health problem, we can guarantee you a jail cell. Now, those behaviors frequently result in acts of violence. Okay? Those behaviors frequently result in deviant behavior that is harmful to other people and the individual. But there isn't much out there for folks like that. Substance abuse is a major public health problem. Substance abuse. How much of our violent crime is driven by alcoholism or by drug addiction or the desire for access to drugs? What is our social network dealing with substance abuse? Jail. Okay? Now, added to that is every other social problem that acts out as deviance. All right? That's what the criminal justice system has to deal with. The challenge for the police department is to develop an array of capacities so we can respond humanely to all of these other problems. Because yes, it's important that I'm here talking about crime, because crime dominates the headlines because it's so easy. Crime is probably 20% of the police department's work. My average copper is out there spending 80 to 85% of his or her day dealing with social problems presenting themselves as things nobody can do anything about except call the cops. You know? We have to work hard to create the uncommitted time, it's called, to fight crime. Creating opportunities to put coppers on footbeats or on bicycles is a major stress for this organization. We have to figure out ways to not respond fast to non-emergency calls. We have to figure out ways to handle calls differently so that we can have a copper on foot in a high-crime neighborhood talking to people. That just doesn't happen. We have to not do other stuff as often or fast to make that happen. So the challenge for us is, yeah, are there tools I'd like to have? Sure. I'd like to see bad guys caught with guns go to jail. That would help. Okay? I would like, and when I say that, why is because no matter how many times you are caught illegally carrying a firearm in this state, it is a misdemeanor, no matter how many times you're arrested. Okay? So if you are a career criminal and you're rational, the rational decision is it is more dangerous for me not to carry a gun because another bad guy will shoot me than it is to carry a gun because I'm arrested, it's a misdemeanor. This is not helpful. It's not helpful that in Wisconsin I can be a statutorily defined career criminal and legally get a concealed carry permit. Yes. Okay? This is not helpful to the cause of law enforcement. And we have a jail, we have a juvenile justice system, and when I say it's failing terribly, it's not because people in it don't want to do a good job. But it does not have the funding right now for either services or sanctions. And what happens is our career criminal young offenders who are like 14 and 15 years old learn nothing for 3 years while they're in the criminal justice system. And then we slap our foreheads when they go to jail as adults. They go to prison. Why? They learned nothing from the juvenile justice system in either sanctions or services. So there are things that need to look at as holistically part of this problem. And I don't have to redistribute the nation's income to impact crime. We've got to focus our resources of both helping and accountability on the 10% of every problem. Okay? Every problem's got the 10% that drives it. The challenge in a society of limited, not limitless resources is focus on those 10%, whatever it is we're solving. And that's where we need help, is help with those 10%, whether they're juveniles or adults.
Let me pick up on the gun discussion here. Have you had meaningful conversations with people in the state legislature? Do you believe that there is any desire on the part of lawmakers right now to address those two issues that you just mentioned?
I've had opportunities to sit down with a couple of the major players, literally, and do a quiet, away from the cameras, PowerPoint of this is how the law is playing out in our city right now. Okay? I'm not hurling thunderbolts at press conferences at them. Because my experience is if you actually want to accomplish something in governing, you have to talk to people away from the media arena. Because that's just entertainment. Okay, and entertainment doesn't solve our problems. So you got to get in a room with somebody and give them a pile of facts and invite honest questions and swear you're not going to talk about the details of the discussion. And in that context, you can begin to get people to see things differently because the ideology blinds people across the spectrum. Ideology has never solved a significant social problem. All right? Understanding the problem and figuring it out solves the problem. And so we've sat down with folks that were big proponents of that law and said, okay, here's the loophole. Here's how it works. Here are stories of individuals that we've caught who've got this many arrests with a legal gun doing this. You don't want this as a campaign ad against you someday. Is there some way we can move there to close this gap, for example? I can honestly say I've gotten respectful hearings, and I'm hopeful perhaps if we remain persistent and don't try to use this as a cudgel, but really try to get people to see the issue as it plays out in the real world, not the ideological world, we can get some improvement in those laws.
You've had some success in terms of telling that story. Those of you in this room, some of you may be familiar with this technology called ShotSpotter. I'll let you briefly explain it, but it allows you to respond to crime scenes where shots are fired in the city. Initially, funding had been taken out of the budget for that. You felt the program had been pretty successful. You made a strong case for why you thought the funding should be put back in. The lawmakers listened to you. The funding apparently is going to be put back in, at least a good chunk of it. So there are cases where you're having some success communicating with members of the legislature.
Yes. I mean, I learned this, I worked for a number of years in the D.C. metropolitan area when I was the police chief in our And so you'll learn a lot having access to Congress and seeing how it works. Because if you're a chief in that area, you get used by your associations to be part of delegations, to go communicate with senators and congressmen. But you really don't. You talk to the 25-year-olds that are running the government. The entire government depends on 25-year-olds who work too long. But at any rate, in that context, you get a sense of how to move things along and how to get people to hear you. And one of the things we found, and I found this being a board member of an outfit called Fight Crime, Invest in Kids, and the purpose of this group was to bring research findings to the attention of Congress that indicated that significant investments in early childhood education and preschool had longitudinally significant crime-fighting capacity. That short money up front could pay dividends at ages 16 to 25, and that there was a lot of research out there that showed decreased victimization, offending, higher graduation rates, so on, so on, so on. So the idea was to put together a bunch of counterintuitive messengers, DAs and police chiefs, to bring this to the attention of Congress during the George Bush the second years. Obviously, it was a Congress that needed to hear these investments in a way that was fighting crime. And the idea was cover everybody's right flank. Okay? Yes, this is a social investment. Yes, this looks like it's a soft on crime initiative, but it's not really. Okay? Because it saves us money at the other end in terms of prosecution and victimization. So when it comes to talking about ShotSpotter, or talking about abandoned houses and the need for demolition, or other issues, sometimes it's helpful to present them as forms of what they are truly, community development and crime fighting. All right? Getting money for housing demolitions targeted in this city fights crime. Because abandoned houses are the sites of burglaries and metal thefts that drive our statistics. Abandoned houses are the locations of crimes of violence and opportunistic crime by gang members because nobody's attending to them. And abandoned houses are a cancer in neighborhoods, undermining its social cohesion and sense of identity, and creating problems of destabilization problems of their own. So, getting us demolition money fights crime. And last August, the governor came and gave us $1 million some, or returned $1 million some, however you want to cut it. He brought money in and announced it in a high crime neighborhood as a crime fighting tool. Great. Everybody in this town knows we need to do something about abandoned and derelict houses. And it's the same thing with ShotSpotter. It's more overtly about crime, but we are putting the ShotSpotter technology in our tipping point neighborhoods. Our goal is to really focus a variety of resources in neighborhoods that have some spine, that have some level of social cohesion, but also a lot of negative social indicators. And so there's a number of neighborhoods we've targeted. We've gotten some federal grants to help us basically build the capacity of these neighborhoods to advocate themselves. It's the police that drove those grants. And then we're working with city government and city hall to see that our demolition money and our ShotSpotter locations go to those neighborhoods as well. So, the vision of this police department is articulated. Our mission is working with the community to create and maintain neighborhoods that can sustain civic life. That's our mission. Okay? Crime fighting is a way we help do that. But the reason people in a free society tolerate a police authority is to create an environment where they can raise their children, go to work, and pursue the American dream. That's our responsibility here. And so it's really important, as you indicate, that as many other things that we can helpfully identify as assisting the stability of our neighborhoods is a form of crime fighting. And something that, because of our unique responsibilities, people are able to hear us say when they might not hear that same thing from a more conventional advocate.
I want to get into the police department's relationship with the community in just a moment. But one question I did want to ask you, because it's a discussion that's taking place in more and more states around the country, and this is whether or not too many people are in prison. In places where you would maybe not expect this, as the state of South Carolina is one. They're reducing the prison population. New York City has done that. There are many fewer people in New York City today in prison than there were decades ago, yet their crime is the lowest it's been in decades. How do you feel as the top law enforcement officer in the city of Milwaukee? How do you feel about the prospect of fewer people in prison? Would it be helpful to, as strange as this may sound, would it be helpful to some neighborhoods that have seen large numbers of men play no role whatsoever in the community?
Well, I think that's a That's a very important social question that deserves a level of discourse far better than it's received. Because it's slipping into two types of conversation right now, neither of which is helpful to the people at the point of the spear of crime. Okay? Because the people that are overwhelmingly victimized by violent public space crime are poor people. All right? Poor people. People in the neighborhoods we're talking about. In this city, all right, if you draw an ellipse where my most violent crime is, will it shock you that it's the same ellipse that shows the lowest graduation rates from high school, or the highest poverty rates, or the highest unemployment rates? Okay? Those are the neighborhoods where people are dying every day because of crime. Okay? So just hold that thought for a moment. I worry when the conversation becomes about cost cutting. Because we've already shown that it's very easy to balance a budget on the backs of the poor and disadvantaged, right? Let's save money. Oh, mental health services. Let's save money. Oh, substance abuse services. Let's save money. Cut aid to cities. Let's save money. Let's dump everybody out of jail. California was ordered to empty out its prisons, and it is. And this is not to say that there aren't people in there that perhaps should not be there for as long as they are. But they're already receiving the negative benefit of it, increased crime in inner city neighborhoods. So, okay, let's release all those offenders. Let's not discriminate in terms of what their offenses were. Let's just release them. And where are they going to go home to? The exact same place where victimization was occurring. Without new job skills and without substance abuse counseling and without mental health counseling. This does not sound like a social plan. The macro issue, what are people in prison for? It's the most expensive resource we have. That is an important discussion to have. All right? I know from experience that in the suburbs, relatively minor crimes get hammered because nothing happens there. And in the cities, where there is intense, serious repeat offenders, where I've got guys who've been arrested 18 and 19 and 25 times that we're now arresting for a homicide, that the sanctions aren't so much as what you think they are. All right? So there are real disparities between what rule offenders can get out of the court system and what we can. There are enormous expenses being undertaken by prison that have probably reached the position of diminishing returns. It's fair to say the drug sentencing laws should be reevaluated because it's so bad. One of the toxic problems of the overinvestment in penal responses to the drug issue is the following. Again, what I learned in Massachusetts with the DOC is we had a significant number of people in state prison for, quote, drug offenses. Yeah. The DA decided to pursue the drug offense because he couldn't guarantee he could put this serial robber, shooter, gangbanger in jail for any of the shootings. So the drug crime got the guy the time. But the average DA wasn't going after that same penalty for other offenders with the same amount. So here's what a society has a real responsibility to get to the bottom of when it uses its penal instrument. Are like offenses in like contexts being treated the same way, macro? That is important. Because if we delegitimize our system of justice, we delegitimize government. And that's the important conversation to have. But that conversation is beyond the statistics. It requires the analysis of the offenses and being a victim of crime. If you're of an African American descent in this city, last year, over 90% of the offenders of homicide and over 80% of the victims of homicide were African American. That's twice the representation in the population. 60% of our robbery victims every year are African American. That's less than 40% of the population. Every year, close to 80% of our aggravated assault victims are African American, with less than 40% of the population. Do they not deserve our protection? And what are the tools at our disposal? So the debate's got to happen, but it's got to be accompanied by a far more sophisticated level of analysis than we're using right now. Or I can guarantee you, when we get the feel-good moment of throwing the jail cells open, those same neighborhoods with those 80 and 90% victimization rates are going to get it in the neck. And we owe them more than that.
I want to pick up on, you mentioned the African American community in Milwaukee, and I want to ask this question. How do you feel your department is doing in terms of building relationships with that community? When you talk to the folks in this community, there are people who are concerned about, for example, the Derek Williams case, a young African American man who dies in the backseat of a squad car, suffocating, he was having medical issues, but he was not attended to at the time. You have reports of illegal strip searches, body cavity searches. There are people in this community who feel that the police are not always there to help them, but they're there to perhaps make their lives a little more difficult, that they don't understand the community. What's your response to people who are concerned about the way your department interacts with the minority community?
Well, I think it's part of the great challenge of policing a diverse democracy. It has been, as long as I've been sensate, there have been concerns in the minority community about the manner in which they're policed. And nobody should ever take it easy on us. The use of armed authority of the state is an important responsibility. Public's heavily invested in whether or not that's used thoughtfully, legally, constitutionally, fairly, and legitimately. So, every time there is a critical incident and these issues arise, they've got to be heard out and responded to. I do know, over the course, not that it necessarily helps with any individual incident, but over the course of a 40-year career, the changes I've seen in policing, in terms of its own diversity, its own selectivity, its own level of training, its own use of restraint, there's been extraordinary declines in uses of force and citizen deaths at the hand of the police in the last several decades. It's far more diverse and selective than it ever was before. The amount of uses of force in this city have declined every year for the last several years. But I have to recognize that every time there is a critical incident, the Band-Aid comes off the wound. And we are seen not as who we are now, we are seen as the symbols of every injustice that people have endured for decades. We are ink blot tests in uniform. Our very appearance on the scene of an incident is going to bring forth from those people involved in that incident everything that's gone before them personally or about which they've heard or whatever their attitudes are about governing or the police. So it's a challenge. The challenge is particularly acute in poor communities of color nationwide. Why? Because those are the communities with the greatest concentration of social problems and the greatest concentration of social problems presenting as crime. All right? Who's called for all of it? The police. And the potential for something to go wrong is always going to be high. The remarkable thing is how seldom it does. All right? I think last year we made something on the order of 34,000 arrests, I think it was. And we had one death in custody that was natural causes. That fact does not please us because we would like nobody to die in our custody. But in our spare time, not only are we the mental health providers of first resort, apparently we're also the diagnosticians of first resort. And there are going to be circumstances where there's going to be an unintended bad thing to happen. Now, I've got to draw a distinction between willful misconduct, which is how we define the cavity search issue, and somebody making the wrong decision but not guided by malice. The Derek Williams case, okay? Cops made the wrong guess. Nothing for it, all right? The challenge is, how much did that impact the actual day-to-day relationships between this police department and its many communities? Because there is no one community. There are many communities out there. And what I do know is that every community meeting I went to over the course of 2012, not one of them didn't have more people in it than I ever saw on the streets. But I never saw TV cameras at the community crime meetings, ever. Okay? I did see extraordinary attention paid to the fact that somebody was demonstrating. Okay, it's all part of the panorama of democracy. But when I go to these community meetings, nobody says we want fewer cops in our neighborhood. Nobody says leave those kids on the corner along that scare me. Nobody says, don't be out here and be present. People want to be treated with respect and dignity, and they want us to be responsive to their concerns. And at the neighborhood level, this department overwhelmingly is. Now, we are going to make mistakes, and occasionally we're going to do wrong. And then the challenge is, are we holding people appropriately accountable while at the same time staying engaged with the community? This department's committed to a community-based policing strategy. And I'm telling you right now, sometimes I feel like Congress. Okay? Congressman's approval ratings are what? 25%?
That's a very good day.
Okay. When was the last time a congressman lost an election? Can you remember the last time a Wisconsin congressman lost as an incumbent? Okay, very rarely. You can remember. What happens? Everybody knows their congressman. That is a good guy. It's Congress. All right, there are times when the police department is in bad favor with the community. But if I went out there into those neighborhoods and said, I'm going to get rid of Captain Morales, I'm going to dump Captain Smith, I'm going to get rid of Captain Regina Howard, I'd be in an uproar. Your cop on the beat, he's out of here. What are you talking about? He's my cop. All right, your community liaison. So all I'm trying to get at is the relationships of this department through its employees to this community are many, textured, nuanced, and constantly going on. And there are going to be times we receive and deserve angry disapproval. And we expect people to demand accountability. But I'm telling you, there is no more accountable organ of government in the country than the average police department. And no aspect of government has evolved as much as we have. I've been present, I've seen it. And anybody old enough has seen the 1968 police departments compared to today's police department. When we are under fire, we're still striving to improve and to respond and to get better and to stop doing the thing that's so alienating. So, bad things happen. They're going to happen. The challenge in the long term is, do they have a dramatic impact on the department's ability to help its community? And I'd say so far, they have not here.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the folks in the room. We'll try to keep this brief, although I know my guess is you probably have strong feelings about this. You mentioned the media a couple of minutes ago. The people laugh when I say it. The Journal Sentinel has done a fair amount of reporting on crime statistics. It has claimed in stories that certain crimes have been misreported, that some crimes were more serious than they were reported or long. You have fired back. But for the people in this room, what would you say to them if they had questions about the veracity of the information that's being reported by your department?
There's probably no single story, and God knows we've had our fair share of thoughtful scrutiny by our newspaper. But I would say of all of the stories, all right, no matter how I found the rest of them, that was the most damaging, harmful, and cheapest shot I've ever taken as a public official. And I say that to a group of people I think are going to be smart enough to understand what I'm saying. The guy who did the article carefully selected a subcomponent of one crime category, aggravated assault. There are 13 kinds of aggravated assault in Wisconsin. Okay? Not all of them are felonies. Not all of them are charged the same way. All of them are in a computer system that populates reports automatically, and our cops are supposed to remember which ones are which. Okay? He took a subset of aggravated assaults that, through his own algorithm, figured out would be the ones most likely to perhaps be mischaracterized. Now, please understand, where you put them in the UCR index has nothing to do with how they're investigated. Has nothing to do with how they're prosecuted. No matter how many pictures of hurt babies he put in the story, none of those people suffered because of how the crime was added in the FBI report that we sent. Okay? So he took a narrow slice of a big crime, and he found there was an X percentage problem with how it was categorized. It was categorized properly for the Uniform Crime Report. Now here's the intellectual dishonesty that I want all of you to hold on to, because it was intellectually dishonest, and this thing could not have gotten published in any peer-reviewed journal. In order to have the banner headline that crime had actually gone up instead of gone down, for the purposes of the article, he had to assume that every single prior year's reports were perfect. Are you with me? Okay? In order to find out that we had, quote, misreported and affected our bottom line, that meant we've done it perfectly every year before. Now, where would they publish that? What professor would let that through? So we did our own audit, which we invited them to look at. We gave it to the fire and police. We went back 6 years and used the same template he did. And what did we find? That for the preceding 5 years or so, when this new computer system was put in, there had been X or Y percentage of that crime that should have been this, that were classified as this. Every single year. But if you examine it every single year, the number of them declined as we got better at the system. So that the year he caught us on was the lowest error rate the department had had in 7 years. And if you just controlled for the error rate, crime had still gone down by just as much as we said it had. Now, I would never expect to see any of that have the light of day, because it screws up a narrative. But that was just wrong, okay? Okay, fine, you beat us over the coals over the personnel records of our coppers. If you don't like the way we handle a call, take your editorial position and beat our brains out. Fine, that's the world I live in. But that was just intellectually dishonest, and it was hurtful, and it just made me question why was it so important to try to discredit a signature accomplishment? All right? If you held constant, by the way, nobody tried to find out if the crime data was accurate before I got here. Fascinating. Okay? If you held constant the crime rate from 2007 over the ensuing 6 years, we'd have had 45,000 more victims than we had. All right? We've had real decreases. We've had increases, homicides up last year, but we've made a measurable impact in the lives of people. Okay? A significant and measurable. Now, I just read today that the outgoing school superintendent, who's leaving to well-deserved compliments for his performance, increased the graduation rate in this city in 4 years by 0.8%. All right? In 6 years, there's been a 26% decrease in crime in this city. That should count for something. No, it counts for oh, no, you can't, it's wrong. Now, you believe me, be prepared. I'll see you in the newspapers. That was a very frustrating time for me.
I'm going to take questions from the audience. I do want to say, in the interest of fairness, that the newspaper said it stands by its reporting, that it believes it did report accurately. Yeah, well, I want to say this. I think that's fair to say. Let's take questions. Could you just hold down that little rim, that button in front of you, just hold down the rim, keep your finger down on that, please. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. Deputy Chief, appreciate your comments. Thanks for coming out today. Recently, there were some reports talking about a bill looking to take on investigations of people dying in custody, out of the hands of the police department. To your credit, you initiated some of the internal investigation of the department, which has been great. Do you agree with that? And the second question is, in some urban environments, there are entertainment venues, clubs, etc. It seems as if the police have been a little bit heavier-handed in clubs that cater to multicultural communities than, let's say, white clubs. That's been a grapevine in the community. Do you see any other preventive measures that can be put in place to kind of kill off some of that disparity?
Well, I'll take the second one first. It's a challenge for us because, we don't drive around looking for bars to mess with. And certainly we spend a fair amount of time on Water Street, dealing with drunken, stupid kids doing drunken, stupid things. Problem we have is we have to be responsive to community concerns. And when a neighborhood surrounding a nightclub is complaining about gunshots and robberies and problems outside the bar, we've got to do something about it. All right? We've got to be responsive. And we find ourselves in a trick bag. Because if I own one of those clubs, and I'm a consistent donator to people's political campaigns, which most of them are, I'm going to throw down the card I got. And if I can get cops to back off the shootings and robberies outside my bar by saying, well, why is there this disparity on who the cops are paying attention to, I know I'm going to get a hearing. Now, we have these conversations inside the police department going, okay, tell me about the bar. Is this something we found out because we were looking for trouble? Or is this something that was community driven? Because I recognize that political reality, although it's an alternate reality, is a form of reality. And I don't want to put the police department at cross purposes with legislators unnecessarily if, there's a way to parse the difference between what that neighborhood is worried about and the fact that we did inspections north side instead of south side this year. I can tell you that the bars that we have been sitting in front of the city council on, who have the most expensive lawyers, are the ones where there's the most violence. Now that's a difficult political issue, particularly when you get downtown. We got the Ladybug Club backing up on multi-million-dollar hotel, investment, and we got guys outside shooting their guns in the air. This is a problem. All right, we've got to do something about it. Obviously, there's millions of dollars at stake and hundreds of jobs, many of those jobs benefiting the north side. What are we going to do to try to tamp it down? So it's not a question of somebody just, picking bars out of a hat. Challenge for us is these taverns that have gotten some scrutiny lately are in the same epicenters that we're talking about. All right, there's more people carrying guns for illegal purposes where that bar happens to be, and when bad things happen at it, we've got to look into it. And so the challenge is the balancing test. What's the level of social harm coming out of this premise versus the fact that now, we can be accused of X, Y, and Z. The first issue, I've already forgotten. So what was it?
This is the law that we have outside agencies investigating.
The city's decided to take an observational role in this legislation. I will tell you anecdotally that the levels of review that exist in Milwaukee right now are far more than the bill envisages. And if you examine the bill exempts from its provisions where over 80% of the in-custody deaths have occurred, which is in custody of sheriff's offices. Sheriff's offices are excised from this bill. Okay? So 80 to 85% of the in-custody deaths aren't covered by the bill, as currently worded. So the way I see it is if this bill passes tomorrow, fine, because it's not asking us to do anything that's not being done already. All right, we've got more people devoted to, the irony is, around the state, people, where's the expertise on investigating these things? Okay? So, we're open, we're an open book, scrutinize away. But I would say, I don't see any problems with the bill from my perspective, because the bill actually has less levels of scrutiny than we endure now.
Let's take some other questions. Yes.
First of all, just want to congratulate you. I was at the symphony Saturday night. That was nice to meet you.
And we haven't talked about the return of the Stradivarius.
We talked about that I haven't followed.
The Journal Editorial Board gave you a big kudos for that. I think that's
Well,
important.
that is true, except they are always at pains to explain to me that the editorial people are completely separated from the repertorial people, right, Ashley? Completely separate. So, anyway, yes, well, it was a good moment for the community. And as I had said that night, I don't know if any of you had a chance to see the movie Monuments Men, which is based on that World War II art recovery unit. There are some wonderful lectures in it about how even in the chaos of the greatest war in humankind, in which devastating casualties were being seen, horrific damage to the fabric of society, the Western democracies still saw this as a value to retrieve the shared cultural heritage of civilization and return it where it belonged. Well, on a small scale, that's what happened here. All right, these couple of knucklehead robbers did the crime of the century, okay? Smart enough to plan it, but not smart enough to figure out that they had this priceless, worthless object. Okay? It's priceless, but nobody's going to buy it from you, pal. Pawn American. Hey, I got a nice violin. But having said that, it wasn't, a piece of, all mysteries are easy to solve in retrospect, right? Because you see them. But in the midst of solving it, those detectives were sifting through a welter of information and contradictory tips and different theories, and everybody in town had a theory of this crime, right? Come on, you had a theory. We all had theories. They had to go where the facts took them. And so through a combination of informants, a combination Following the evidence, a combination of real skillful interviews and interrogations, they were able to effect the arrest in a week, which is damn good. And I know there's always going to be naysayers out there, but I feel proud because at the same time that this Violin was being investigated, every single murder that's taken place in this city this year was solved. Okay, so it wasn't like people took off homicide investigations just to do the Violin. They were long, long days, but they got all their work done.
Let's take other questions. Oh, yeah.
In several times today, you've mentioned that mental health illness plays a large role in the crimes of the city. You find that the majority are not only the perpetrators, but the victims? And secondly, what training and what partnerships do your officers have as they go out to the scenes?
Well, obviously, they're both. I mean, if you do a diagnostic in the average state prison, you're going to see a wide spectrum of people with various issues presenting as the conduct they engaged in. So yeah, they can be victims or offenders, both. All right. I mean, it's difficult. It's challenging. Do our officers get training? Yes, they all get some training in the academy. We've got about, I think there's something between 20 and 30% of the department has gone through critical incident training, crisis intervention training, which is a communications course, and they are all on call. Now, we haven't trained the whole department in the hall course yet because that's not recommended by the people that run the course. People that run CID training recommend that you train those people who will most benefit by it because some people are really good communicators to start with. They're the ones that you want to have be your specialists, even as other people are familiar with the approaches embedded in CID training. So, at any rate, we do get officers in that very specific training. We do use them to intervene when we can when there's a mental health crisis. But it really goes to the heart of what I'm saying before. Here we go again. I've got 1,800 men and women out there who are being asked to deal with virtually every single social problem that presents as an inconvenience, discomfort, or issue. Okay? They're getting called and dispatched 250,000 times a year. All of these are calls about something that shouldn't be happening, which is happening, about something about which something should be done now. How many things fit that? Okay? Car accidents, medical calls, mental health crisis, substance abuse issues, family problems, kid issues, store issues, tenant landlords, everything. Okay? Everything. Now. And the response always is, well, the police need more training in this, and the police need more training in that, and the police need more training in this, and the police need more training. The academy is 6 months long now. Okay? Think big, folks. It's this one group that right now has the weight of every single social problem on it. And maybe we should start asking ourselves, do we need to double back and see what else we're doing? Because I'll tell you right now, the fire department never gets attacked because it goes to the poorest neighborhoods in the city where most of the structure fires are. Nobody says, fire department's spent an awful lot of time in those neighborhoods. When the public health department goes where there's intergenerational poverty because that's where the low birth weight babies are and that's where the kids who die of sudden infant death and that's where infant mortality is highest, people will say, what's the Department of Public Health spending so much time in those neighborhoods for? Why are they in the rich neighborhoods? Okay? The problems of intergenerational, endemic, hardcore poverty are pernicious and affect everything. But somehow we figured out, what's the police department doing in those neighborhoods? And that's a political response, not a societal response. And we got to think better about that.
Let me get over to this side of the room. Yes, sir. Hang on one second. Wait for the microphone, please.
You mentioned in your comments there was a discussion about what's going on in Chicago. One of the things that they're doing is identifying people who are likely to commit crimes and getting these at-risk kids into groups to prevent them from committing crimes. I'm wondering, what is the police department here doing in Milwaukee to work with MPS to, I guess, identify the potential troublemakers and help them be better citizens?
Well, there was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, I was here, and somebody brought in a bunch of people from Chicago. They were called the interveners.
with the documentary.
Yeah, they did a documentary, and everybody loved it because they were all ex-gang members, and they all now knew how to talk the talk and walk the walk. And everybody loved them. And here's what I found out about innovative crime control tactics. They all work at first. Okay? Question is, will they work over time? Will they survive the first iteration of those committed personalities leaving them? Problem with the interveners is the longitudinal research didn't work. Why? Because a whole bunch of the interveners ended up in jail. Okay? So the challenge was, some of the interveners are always going to be great because they truly did put their past behind them. Some of them got caught up again in it as well. What we are finding is that, Chicago's everybody's hero right now because they had a good year last year, and I really like this network analysis. Year before last, they were getting their brains knocked out on homicides. And they were coming up here saying, what are you guys doing about the homicide thing? Okay? Now they're down there and they had a great year, and we're going to look at what they did, because one of the things about law enforcement is we are constantly looking to each other. What's happening in other cities? And I'm so glad you mentioned that at the top end, because most of them, when they get covered by their newspaper, everybody just talks about them. We're talking about each other. All right? We're looking at our poverty rates and our crime rates, and where do we fit in, and what's our trend, and what's your trend, and what did you do differently? And you're right, the trends have been mixed. Some cities are doing well in the same crimes we are, and they're having the same problems we are. Some are doing well across the board. One-year trends never tell you anything. You got to look at 4 and 5-year trends. And so, we are out there doing a lot of youth outreach. Totally reinvigorated the school unit, so it's more dialed into the schools as communities rather than as just, they're not school police now. We're community police in the schools. The other thing we've done, we've got something called the STOP program. It's called Students Talking It Over with Police. We pioneered it. Goal of the STOP program is to reach out, not so much to kids at risk, except being risk of victims, but to reach out to the kids in the neighborhoods at risk, and the neighborhoods that are at risk, because we want to reach out to the future leaders of Milwaukee. There are kids all over this city living in poor neighborhoods with bright futures with half a friggin' chance. Half a chance. And that's pretty good for me today, actually. With half a chance. And so the challenge is, what tools can we give them to make them better citizens? Because nobody teaches civics anymore. So we started a program to explain to them what the police do, what our actions are based on, what you have a right to expect of us as a citizen in terms of our contact and our interactions, how you can complain about us, how you can support about us, which is a whole course on you interacting with the system. And then we give them identity cards afterwards so they can, it just says, I completed the STOP program, it's good for a free hamburger at McDonald's. All right? Just like a cop. But the point is, it's not true, but the point is that the idea is to engage with young citizens who are in at-risk neighborhoods. I don't want to think of these kids at risk per se. They're at risk only because of where they live. And I think we've got a vested interest as the police department, because they see us the most, to bring them in and say, okay, you're a citizen of America. Someday you're going to be in a leadership position. Let us sit down with you. Here's the crime data in your neighborhood. Can we invite you in to be part of the discussion? And I don't know the impact it's going to have on crime, but I do know it's having an impact on their attitudes, because we've had it measured by UWM, and we're going to keep at it because we think it helps these kids improve their chances moving forward.
I'm going to wrap things up. 30 seconds. We are going to see more cops on the street in the next year or two. There will be more cops hired in the next year or two.
Well, one of the remarkable things, really, when you think about it, and again, people for some reason want to attack Milwaukee by how it's managed. I can't figure that out because I'm dialed into the network of chiefs. Not many big cities in our economic circumstance have been hiring cops every year for 6 years. We have. And I think Mayor Barrett and this administration deserve credit for that, because they've also fully funded the pension, by the way, which most cities haven't. So we're making progress. Aren't we as big as we'd like to? The chief of my son's police department in D.C., which is our size, has literally twice as many police officers as we do. Okay? And they're getting kudos for doing improvements that are no better than ours. So I know we're doing a good job. I know this city is stretching itself with the resources it can provide, and it's made public safety a priority. So we're going to continue to be out in those neighborhoods. You'll see us out there on foot and on bicycles once it gets a little warmer out, and we're going to do our best to reverse last year's trends.
I'm going to wrap things up there. I do want to say just a couple of things before we go. More events are coming. Be sure to check the website, law.marquette.edu. On the 17th of March, we have Congressman Reed Ribble and Mark Pocan. They're part of the group in Washington that's trying to work together to, as they say, fix problems instead of merely fight over problems. They will be here on the 17th. On March 25th, Mary Burke, Democratic candidate for governor, will be here. That is already a full room. So if you're coming, great. If you're not, whatever. We'll also be doing some more polling this spring. Those are always interesting. I see Professor Franklin's in the back of the room already contemplating the next round of questions. So until then, we want to say thank you to all of you for being with us today, and most of all, thanks to Chief Flynn for joining us.